I'm Ben Sharman, Senior Global Policy Manager at UKRI, and I'm the moderator of the full scientific session, The Impact of Humanity's Regional Dependencies on Coastal Ecosystems. Thank you for joining us and for your interest in this session. This presentation is one of 3 pre-recorded videos focusing on a speaker's material before all the panelists come together in February for a live discussion. In this video, Elisa Morgera, Research Professor of Global Environmental Law and Co-Director of Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance, will be discussing the impact that regional communities are having on these coastal ecosystems. Following Elisa's presentation, Sylvia Shazbo, Research Professor on Social Welfare at Dongguk University, will be also joining the discussion to discuss the material. So Elisa, over to you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss with you the work on marine ecosystems and the impacts and opportunities for coastal communities and other members of society to benefit fairly and equitably from a more sustainable and integrated management of the ocean. This is a presentation based on ongoing work and research and collaborations under the One Ocean Hub, where we have working with colleagues across the UK, in South Africa, Namibia, Ghana, Kenya, the Caribbean, and the South Pacific. And I think thinking about coastal communities and the ocean, it's really important to keep in mind how we have one interconnected ocean that connects us in time, in space, in cultures, in our imagination. And yet in many areas of the world, our relationship with the ocean is quite different. And we have the words there from a South Pacific thinker and writer, where we can see how societies and humans feel part and parcel of the ocean, but that's not necessarily the reality that others may be familiar with in other parts of the world. We know that there are multiple and increasing uses of the oceans for different sectors of society. Some are very, very visible and very well known for their degrading effects on the ocean, such as fishing and overfishing, the production of energy, transport and communication. But we also benefit in multiple ways, and increasingly we understand in how many deep ways we benefit from healthy oceans, and not only coastal societies, but really society at large. We benefit in terms of food, but revenue from tourism and trade, in terms of medical developments, but also the oxygen we breathe, the carbon and water cycle, they all depend on a healthy ocean. So there are multiple uses which bring multiple threats to the ocean, but also multiple benefits that all of us, in particular coastal communities, draw from the ocean. Now, in addition to those that are very visible and documented, we also have more mysterious, maybe unknown or little understood or sometimes unheard connections to the oceans. Many coastal communities have different spiritual and religious connections to the ocean, including to very remote areas such as the deep seabed. We have emotional connections, including those of marine scientists who devote their lives to the study of the ocean and life in the ocean. We have connections that live long even after fishing communities or other coastal communities have been displaced from the coast. We have indigenous and local knowledge that provide insights into how the ocean lives and how it's related to our well-being on Earth. And invisible economies, activities related to the ocean that we may not be aware of, that may not be in the minds of those thinking about GDP and national level economies, and yet are very important at the local level, such as the collection and making of seashells and the making of, say, necklaces by certain communities for both ceremonial purposes, but also as a revenue in the context of tourism. And we have, thanks to the work of our colleagues at Rhodes University, tried to bring to the fore more clearly that diversity of different voices and connections that often are not taken into account in decision-making on the ocean and our ocean uses of it. The purpose of the One Ocean Hub has really been to focus on governance, and this is the contribution I'll make to this panel, thinking about how we make decisions on the ocean and how we can, with research, contribute to more integrated and inclusive governance with a view to really benefiting the coastal societies that are the most affected by negative impacts arising from our unsustainable uses of the ocean, and the ones whose lives, cultures, identities are the most dependent on a healthy ocean. And we're doing that by looking at multiple pressures, both on the ocean itself, but also on the contributions the marine ecosystems provide to our human well-being, ecosystem services, and really thinking around how we can have a more productive dialogue across sectors that are often in tensions with one another and potentially in conflict with one another, with a view to connecting the norms that apply to the ocean, connecting different forms of knowledge, and forging new partnerships, sustainable and fair partnerships across different sectors of society who benefit, who are affected, who depend on certain uses of the ocean. And to do that, to really expect decision makers to take such more integrated decisions in an inclusive fashion, our understanding is that as researchers, we need to change in that way first and foremost. We need to work more closely together across different disciplines and together with different stakeholders and right holders in defining the research agenda and carrying out the research so that we can together provide that more integrated evidence base to decision makers and provide them also with tools, with approaches on how to hold those conversations, often difficult and entrenched conversations about the use of the ocean in a constructive and transformative manner. How we're trying to do this is looking at the role of law in supporting those constructive dialogues and understanding where the law does create obstacles to that dialogue, looking at the role of arts to support the research to help us understand what are the emotional connections, and also to connect coastal societies and other sectors of society to the research so that different sectors of society can contribute to it. We're looking at the sector of fisheries, not just as a monolith, but as a sector made of subsectors, which may be in competition with each other, particularly looking at small-scale fisheries as opposed to large-scale commercial fisheries. And we're trying to showcase how the research that's quite unknown maybe to most in the depths of the ocean is really relevant for us on land to understand hidden trade-offs in our decisions, how the least understood services that the ocean and marine life provide to us are something that may be off our radar screen when we take decisions on certain uses, be that the use of renewables or other energy development in the ocean, tourism development, and so on. And through that, really understanding what coastal societies, blue societies offer to our understanding of the relationships between humans and the ocean. In terms of cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, invisible forms of knowledge, invisible economies, and also injustices that coastal communities are and have experienced, and how all of that needs to inform our understanding of the options before us before we take a certain decision. As an international lawyer myself, I'm particularly focusing on the role of law in supporting that integrated and inclusive approach to governance, to how we take decisions on the ocean to the benefit of coastal societies. And from a legal perspective, we know from a long time that one of the problems is that we have multiple bodies of law, often not necessarily well integrated with each other, that all contribute to make complicated the taking of decisions on the oceans. That has to do with the protection of the environment, economic development, including trade and investment, the protection of human rights, but also the fact that we have multiple roles, not just those of the state and local, maybe local administrations, but rules applicable to business, the customary norms of indigenous peoples and local communities, international and regional rules. All of those are in a complex relationship and don't necessarily all speak in unison in order for us to be clear about what we need to do for integrated decisions on the marine environment. And our approach in the One Ocean Hub is explore how we can use the understanding of the interdependencies between human rights and the marine environment to really bring more coherence in how we use and develop the law for better governance for the ocean. So understanding how our basic rights to life, to health, to food and water, to culture are all interdependent in some more obvious and less obvious ways from life in the ocean. So how that works in practice is really that using the law to bring together the marine and the social sciences, understanding how, as we advance our knowledge of how the ocean lives, what kind of organisms are there, what kind of functions they perform, and how our life on Earth is dependent on those functions. That's the role of the marine sciences. And then bringing that together with what the social sciences can tell us about who is most vulnerable to threats to the ocean, and particularly marine life. They may provide certain services, who has the most interesting knowledge, and how we can work in a collaborative and respectful manner with those knowledge holders. What are the tensions and the difficulties that have already been experienced in society in relation to resulting from decisions on the ocean, and bringing all that understanding in the legal framework, showing how these are all matters that already are relevant from an international perspective, and that do speak at the same time of our obligations to protect the marine environment and everybody's obligation to respect and promote human rights. And we'll use that then to look at how we can understand, for instance, how we can advance more integrated assessments of risks on the ocean, looking both at, again, the natural science perspective, new risks that we understand are affecting fish stocks, multiplied by the effects of climate change and ocean plastics, looking at how different resources, living resources in the ocean, may be in competition with each other, or our decisions about one may provide and may lead to unintended impacts on other resources. So for instance, our choices around the use of marine minerals may affect opportunities to use in the future instead freshwater resources that may be under the seabed, or marine living resources that will be essential for medical discoveries. And within that also, how we can make those exercises, those integrated assessments that are quite, of course, where we're pushing the boundaries of where the science is, how to make those accessible and inclusive of non-academic perspectives, and make them relatable to the lives and the experiences of those coastal communities who are ultimately impacted by the decisions taken on the basis of those assessments. And we're going to do that by using a spatial management, the use of different maps that can overlay all the sets of data and speak to the different, to the importance of that data for the realization of both human rights and the protection of the marine environment, but also looking at the role of arts as a way to open up and experience in a more immersive way those planning processes, those scenario making processes, and ultimately have a productive and open conversation across different sectors of society and different members of society with different forms of knowledge and values related to the ocean. So I'll leave it at that for now and look forward to a discussion.
Now can I invite Sylvia to join the conversation?
I was really listening to the presentation with great interest. It's such a fascinating and challenging research area. A lot, I think, of very important elements in this research project. And you mentioned the importance of different stakeholders, and that you are not only engaging with scientists, but also with local communities. And I saw also in the project UN organizations. I was wondering also to what extent the hub is able to engage with the private sector, the private stakeholders, and associations, for example, of private sector bodies, because we know that private sector, of course, has also huge impact on marine ecosystems. So I was just wondering in terms of the role of the private sector.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. And again, the lens of human rights and the environment is really what has also guided our engagement with different stakeholders, and the realization that among those stakeholders, there are human rights holders, and particularly local communities, indigenous peoples, women, children, raise particular concerns that are protected in law and require particular attention and emphasis on certain aspects. And this is where I think our collaboration with the United Nations comes in, as they're also working in that human rights-based approach, and we have quite a lot of lessons learned to share. The private sector is also increasingly scrutinized for their conduct vis-a-vis human rights, and we have made a lot of progress internationally to understand what we all expect private companies to do in terms of respecting human rights, even when maybe nationally the protection of those human rights may not be up to international standards. And so this is the approach that we're taking within the hub. We haven't yet reached out to specific partners within the private sector, but we are, I think that the idea of working with associations is a really helpful one, because it can help with that structured dialogue around both understanding the contribution of the private sector, but also discussing the responsibility and seeing whether there can be engagement in those terms for the purposes of our research. But clearly, most uses of the ocean include and are driven by the private sector, and that is an essential interlocutor for long-standing and integrated dialogue on this.
Thank you. And you mentioned also all those different tensions. I think the word tensions appeared several times between tensions or perhaps different interests of communities, local communities, people whose livelihoods really depend on those maritime ecosystems. And then, for example, industry. I was also wondering, when it comes to practicalities and choosing some research activities, and obviously then trying to perhaps influence also policy, perhaps influence law, are there any difficulties also in terms of dealing with those tensions in the work of the hub?
I think tensions and conflicts are very present. They're very well known in the marine sector, but there are also tensions that we experienced as a research community within the hub. We all come with our own understanding and experiences. And I think some of the sciences, this was one of the initial, I think, challenges for us, come with a certain understanding of what our role is and how we're expected to carry it out. So there were tensions among the researchers, and then tensions among the sectors of society we're working with, including historical ones. And what we have decided to do with the One Ocean Hub, and really maximizing the opportunities to use research to address those well-known and embedded development challenges, is to look at tensions and conflicts as an area of research. And first of all, try and be as explicit as we can when we experience tension or conflict, and then try and see how much can we learn from that conflict. How much are we able to develop tools to transform a conflict into an opportunity for mutual understanding and ideally consensus building? How we're doing that in terms of research? I mean, from a legal perspective, again, relying on human rights, we have a long tradition of legal thinking about balancing of different interests, and particularly looking at the kind of the common good public goals vis-a-vis more private or individual interest. And that's one technique that we're trying to use, and also empowering different actors to be able to reason in terms of their own rights and not just claims who may or may not be recognized by others. But we're also relying on the role of arts as a tool for transforming conflicts, for allowing different sides of a debate to be empathetic with where the other side is coming from. And the experience of amphitheater that our colleagues are experimenting with in South Africa has been quite incredible in showing how the audience could really empathize with the actors going across dividing lines such as gender, age, race.